Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Last week, we introduced you to a conspiracy theory that has fooled the world for almost 2 centuries. The myth that the church and science have been engaged in a battle for over 2,000 years. And during the millennia when the church was in power, they were burning science books and whole libraries like the one at Alexandria in Egypt that contained thousands of books, the collective scientific knowledge of the world at that time, and even burning the scientists themselves, torturing and imprisoning them, even killing them. And as a testament to how this distorted version of history has seeped into the 21st century zeitgeist, I talked to a dozen people around me, friends, family, and neighbors, and I asked them all a few key questions about the Galileo affair, the burning of the library at Alexandria in the Dark Ages, and you'll hear their collective responses later on in this episode. But I also asked them an overall question. How would they describe the relationship between the church and science in the past? Was it friendly, neutral, or unfriendly? And before I let you hear what they had to say, I'd ask you, the listener, to pause for a moment and consider how you would have responded to that question if I'd reached out to you and asked, was the relationship between the church and science friendly or neutral or unfriendly? And I want to emphasize that I'm asking about that relationship in the long distant past. Here's what my polling group had to say.
I would think, and I don't have anything to base this on other than my intuition, but I would think that it would be hostile and unfriendly in the past, because I think that the church would have seen science as a threat to faith.
I would tend to say unfriendly, but that's a very broad statement, and I don't think that's true across the board.
I would describe it as unfriendly and perhaps improving. You know, I think in modern times, maybe leaders within the church have grown more accepting of scientific discovery and research. But again, I wouldn't describe that relationship necessarily as a positive or fruitful relationship.
You know, I know what the common answer is that the church opposed science and was hostile towards science. But I actually don't know if that's true. My perception is that the church had a disinterested view of science.
I would describe it as complicated or unfriendly or at odds with each other.
Church and science wasn't separate until the 17th-ish century with the Enlightenment and separating. They were one and the same. From a Western perspective, all science was done within the silo of the church, or within, the echo chamber of the church. There wasn't, to my knowledge, not really such a thing as science apart from the church.
In the past, it was more unfriendly. As time has progressed, there are more theologians, Christian theologians, who are trying to use science to strengthen your faith in God. So I think that it's not such a great divide anymore. I think there are more people that are trying to, the unexplained maybe can only be explained through faith, but they're still trying to figure out the science behind it.
It was unfriendly. It was confrontational on the side of the church, wanting to maintain their power. I think that's what it boils down to.
Unfriendly. The church has perceived some of science's conclusions as contradicting what they think the Bible teaches.
If you're talking about especially in the past, I would say very unfriendly at times. Historically, I think that has been a major conflict for the church in prior times in history, for sure.
I think these represent quite well the norm for the 21st century Western thinking. Now, fortunately, conspiracy theories tend to have a shelf life. As time goes on, as scholars do their work to educate the public, fewer and fewer people will hold on to these distortions. Just think again about the 9/11 plane crashes and flat earthism. But some of these distortions can persist or even be resurrected. The White House has just released a room full of classified documents pertaining to the Kennedy assassination. We'll have to see what swirls out of that mess. And young Earth creationism is dying a very slow death. And it looks like the world is slowly letting go of this conflict thesis. Here's one of the reasons why I say that. Another one of the questions that I pose to my friends and family and neighbors. After asking them about the relationship between religion and science in the long-distant past, I then asked whether Christianity today is inherently anti-science. And here's what they had to say.
I think there are certainly sects of Christianity that are anti-science. I think in the past, that would have been more top-down. But in our current culture, I think that would come from the bottom up. I see more independent or non-denominational churches leaning into the anti-science camp.
I think there's always been parts of Christianity that are in ways anti-science. And I think there's always been parts of Christianity that have been in ways pro-science, if we want to call it that. So to the extent that Christianity has been anti-science, I think that you have people in positions of authority who are approving or disapproving of approaches to science, but those people in positions of authority are responding to collective belief.
They're not really. Yes and no. There's so many varieties of Christianity. I can't make a blanket statement on that.
If Christianity has been anti-science, again, it has been in the recent past. It has been increasingly hostile towards science in recent decades. I think the hostility towards science comes mainly from local pastors and the parishioners themselves. Ironically, the higher-ups in church leadership have a disinterested view of science.
I don't think so. I think if Christians believe that God and their belief in God is true, then they shouldn't be afraid of science. The two should be working together. I'm not sure that God wants us to have every single answer. I think there's always going to be a mystery, that's the faith part of it. But I don't think as Christians we need to be afraid of science. I think there are some Christians who think that science thinks they have the answer and then something changes in science just like it does in faith. But there are people who are afraid, who are very rigid, that my way is the only way, and they don't want to change on that at all.
No. Inherently, no, I don't think so. Probably in the past, and I think it comes down to power and control. And I think as long as power and control is not interrupted, especially like when Christianity was more concentrated in like the Pope and Roman Catholicism, I think that science would have been okay as long as it didn't interfere with the power and control of the people. And now, in modern times, I think people have understood that that is not the case. And as long as you leave power out of it, I think that Christianity and science, it's not mutually exclusive.
I think it can be, but it certainly doesn't need to be.
No, Christianity is not anti-science. My perspective on science is that it reveals more of the truth of what true Christianity is all about when it's done well and accurately.
There is an anti-intellectualism thread within Christianity, within the Bible, and within Christianity, definitely. It's not anti-science per se, it's anti-intellectual, anti-critical thought, anti-independent thought, logic, reason, go by data, experience, so there is that within them. But at the same time, of course, the science and intellectual thought flourished in the Christian world, so couldn't be so extreme, right?
So it looks like there's some hope for the future, that the efforts of historians and theologians and authors like our two guests, Dr. Ungurianu last week and his co-author this week, those efforts are paying off. So who is this co-author that we'll be talking to today? David Hutchings graduated with a first-class physics degree from the University of York in 2003 and now teaches at Pocklington School in the north of England. He's a fellow of the Institute of Physics, an honorary fellow at Durham University, and a regular speaker nationwide on the history, philosophy, and theology of science. And he's written 3 books which bring science down to the lay level. We'll hear more about those later in this episode. From David himself, who's here right now in the studio. David, Thanks for coming on to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
I really enjoyed this book. We talked last week to your co-author, James Ngurianu, about Of Popes and Unicorns, Science, Christianity, and how the conflict thesis fooled the world. And I really enjoyed the book. It gave me a lot of insight into this conflict thesis, which has fooled the world, and people don't realize it's just invaded the zeitgeist of our time. What got you into that topic, and what got you connected to James to write this book?
So what had happened was earlier, a few years earlier, I had been invited to write a book with a chap called Professor Tom McLeish, who is a fellow of the Royal Society. He had written already on the topic of God and science in a book with Oxford University Press called Faith and Wisdom in Science. And it was a real academic deep dive into theology and how that interacts with the various different sciences and philosophy and history. And he had been asked by a publisher to produce a popular level version of that book. And through various slightly odd interactions, he ended up approaching me and asking me if I would do it as a school teacher, because that's my day job. I teach high school. And so my job often, when I'm teaching physics to high schoolers, is to take pretty complicated ideas and then bring them down to a level where someone can listen to a story about it or build a picture about it. And so, you know, if I'm not interesting, I'm in trouble when I'm standing in front of a bunch of teenagers. So we ended up writing a book together called Let There Be Science. And it's a sort of gentle exploration of his ideas, but at the popular level. And then off the back of that, I was asked to write again. And this time it was I was asked to write about Stephen Hawking, because in 2018, Stephen Hawking died. And there was a sort of a chance to look again at his career and what were the great achievements of his career and how did they knit together with the big questions about God and the universe and so on. So I ended up teaming up again with another top scientist called David Wilkinson in the UK. And we wrote a book together about Stephen Hawking. And all this time, I found myself thinking, okay, but why? Why are we writing books about God and science? Why is this a thing? People generally are not having much of a conversation about God and music, although that conversation could be had, or God and art, and that conversation could be had, and God and English literature. All these things are topics of interest that could have spawned lots of books, but it just doesn't seem to be much of a public conversation. Whereas everybody seems to have something to say about God and science. And so it got me wondering why. What is going on? What's underneath it? And why is there also this sense of antagonism or tension or opposition or everybody wanting to put their tuppence worth in about the exact relationship? And so what I then decided to do was see if I could come up with the origin story, the God versus science origin story. And when I began to do a little bit of research on that, I kept stumbling across these two names, Andrew Dickson White and John William Draper. And I thought, okay, these names are coming up so often that I need to dig deeper into these two folk. And when I did, I found that someone had written about them already. And that guy was a chap called Tim Larson. So I emailed him and said, would you be interested in writing an origin story about these two chaps who we'll obviously talk more about later in the episode? And he said, it's not me you want to talk to, it's James Ngurianu. He is basically the world expert on these two people, Andrew White and John Draper. So I emailed him and he said, well, read my thesis. So I did. And then I came back and said, I think this would make a great book. And so our eventual output, which to come full circle, I ended up writing with Oxford University Press, of Popes and Unicorns, the book you mentioned, is a sort of popularization of the research that James had done in his thesis. And we've added a few extra ideas in there to make it slightly wider than the topic of his thesis. But in general, it's his scholarship, and then it's me. The real scholarly weight comes from James, and then I'm the entertainer.
Well,
That's how it worked.
Scott mentioned that last week. Scott, the witticisms.
Yeah, no, I asked, who was responsible for the witness. I really enjoyed the book as well, and that's one of the things that I enjoyed about it was that every once in a while these little things would pop up, and it was good. It keeps you interested, and it sets a tone as well that was very helpful.
So, David, why don't we begin with you giving your definition of the conflict thesis? What is it? Where it came from?
Sure. So what James will undoubtedly have told you is that the conflict thesis is a historical idea. Now, I don't think I'd fully grasped that. And I thought that the conflict thesis was more pervasive than that, that it covered more. So that if Bob down the street thinks that God and science are opposed to each other in his mind, then that is the conflict thesis. So for me, I began with this idea that the conflict thesis is very general. It is anybody thinking that God and science are opposed in any way. But as a historian, James pointed me to the fact that actually the conflict thesis, capital C and capital T, is a historical position. It's a position that says, here's a description of history, and over the course of history, belief in God and scientific thought have been at war with one another. And then what happens is several events are picked out and several personalities are picked out as examples of battles in this war. But the war has always sat there. The war is, it's a fundamental war that has been waged throughout human history. And that is distinct from saying that there's some kind of, long word alert, epistemic battle between God and science. It's not that God and science have to be opposed. It's just that they have been. And I think that's quite interesting.
So it's a historically contingent situation as opposed to something that's inevitable or, like you described, kind of inherently epistemic.
Yes, that's right. In the same way that you might say, here are two countries that have been at war with each other a lot, but that doesn't mean that there's something inherent that meant that they had to be at war. They just have been at war. But I think what's interesting is that when the general public think about the conflict thesis, they don't think of it as historically contingent like that. They tend to think of it being a necessary battle, that it's tied in to what science is and what belief in God is. It's not just something that happened by chance and we look back and describe it, but it's an inevitability. And I think that's how the general public think about the conflict thesis.
I agree. It was interesting. A number of years ago, I was having a conversation with a group of people, and one of the people had a master's in engineering, quite a analytical, scientific person. And she suddenly just kind of blurted out. She said, "Oh, I don't believe in God. I believe in science." And I kind of looked at it quizzically, and I just said, like, okay, well, explain what that means. And she kind of stumbled, and but it was just inherent in her that it's either or, and I believe in science. I don't believe in God. So that just to what you're saying, I think that's very true. Yeah, in general. And to me, the conflict thesis just is almost an apologetic for that view. In other words, there's the fundamental view that I believe they're not compatible, and the conflict thesis just further undergirds that, because look at how religion has treated science. They burned Bruno, they persecuted Galileo, and so on and so forth. So it almost acts more as an apologetic view rather than the cause of that view. Would you agree with that, or what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate assessment of exactly what's going on. That instead of these different historical events being pointed to as quirky or interesting or as a pattern, they're pointed to as examples of something that's really deeply embedded in the nature of science itself and the nature of religion itself, which is why you get all these spin-off quotes from it that say things like, faith is belief without evidence and science is based on evidence, because what that does is it allows you to put the whole thing together as a kind of unavoidable clash.
And that's what we wanted to talk with you about, David. We heard last week from James. He gave us a lot of the history. He talked about the theological developments that led up to this Draper and White and their idea, some of the sociological issues. But we also heard that a lot of what they based their ideas on was a distorted view of history. And we want to leave a lot of space. We didn't really talk about that last week because we understand that's where you come in the duo, you and Dr. Ungurianu. You're the Mythbuster. So, so what I want to do then is to unpack some of those myths, getting your perspective on that. So the first question I asked them was the story of Galileo challenging the idea that we have the sun moving across the face of a flat Earth, moving across the sky like a bird or an airplane, if they were to understand airplanes. And Galileo replacing that with the heliocentric theory, the Earth is a sphere orbiting the sun. And I want to emphasize what I asked them. I did not say anything about the church or religion. I didn't tell them this is going to be a faith versus science question. I'm just going to ask you a question. I want to get your answer. And my specific question to them was basically, how did the people at that time respond to Galileo? I didn't say the church. I said, how did the people at that time respond to Galileo? Who was supporting him? Who was opposing him? And here's what I heard from them.
I think Galileo was declared a heretic and considered crazy. And they didn't like it. They put him away. I don't know if they put him away. They clearly didn't like it, and they challenged him on it.
He was not literally, but figuratively crucified for it. I seem to remember that there were people in support of him. Who was pushing back? My understanding is that it was the church in their role as state power.
I know that he presented it to the powers that be at that time. I believe it was the church, and he was basically shunned, and his ideas were shot down, basically told they held no merit.
Could have been the church. They did not agree with it. I think there was much calamity over it.
And was anyone on his side agreeing with him?
The scientists of the time.
I am assuming that they didn't respond very favorably, only because new ideas, I think, probably would have been seen as blasphemous or sacrilegious or just scandalous in general.
So the scientists were on his side. The church was opposing because the church was threatened by different knowledge. They would have thought that he was crazy. They didn't burn him. I forget what they did to him. But they didn't want him around.
I think when people first heard about Galileo, they probably thought he was crazy. And I think that after that, people were questioning it. So they were trying to prove him wrong and sent out explorers to see if there was a way to know where the end of the earth was or how they could explore to prove him right or wrong.
Yeah, I thought they were ready to label him as a heretic and have him punished, whether it was, by killing him or imprisoning him. I can't remember. I think it was the organized church that was opposing him, and I think it was science that was supporting him.
And so I think he wasn't well received largely because of style and things like that, and defensiveness more than sort of straight physics. Well, of course, yeah, he was brought up basically by the church, but at the instigation of the professors because he was ruffling feathers. And so then he eventually got, house arrest and all that kind of stuff, right?
It wouldn't surprise me if he was martyred, but I don't know how he was treated.
So, David, that's what several non-experts understand based on what they've picked up. Well, we'll talk later where they picked up these ideas. What's the version that people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and others would like us to believe, and what's the scholars' version of that story?
Yeah, well, people actually still argue about Galileo now, even. And I mean, scholars are still arguing exactly about it. But would it be okay if I gave a sort of little bit of background? We go one generation back from Galileo first?
Absolutely.
Is that okay? Well, it's actually slightly more than one generation. But if we go back earlier to Nicholas Copernicus, he was trained in holy orders and he loved astronomy and became a pretty good astronomer. And he lived in a world where Aristotle and the Greeks had put together a cosmos of concentric rings or concentric spheres which rotated and made each other rotate. And people have been very happy with that for a very, very long time. and with the Earth in the center. And the reason that people have been very happy with it for a very long time is that's what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
The stars, nearly all of the stars move together across the sky in unison. They're clearly a very long way away, and they seem to be embedded in a sphere. It's a very natural belief. It's what things look like. And the Earth doesn't feel like it's moving. The Earth feels like it's in the middle of this. And then you get these problematic 5 stars that don't follow the others, okay? Which the Greeks called the wanderers. They did their own thing because sometimes they'd go backwards. They would seem to drift with the stars and then go back on themselves. And this became a puzzle to solve. And the way that it was solved was to say, well, all of the other stars, these fixed stars, they're embedded in one sphere. And then some of the other heavenly bodies, these 5 planets and the sun and the moon, are embedded in their own spheres. And these spheres are all nested inside each other. And the big challenge became, could you devise a mathematical model with all these spheres sitting inside each other, where they rotate at nice constant speeds because they should be moving constantly because that's beautiful, and still get the observations that you actually see when you look out into the sky? And that was a main goal in astronomy. And by the time Copernicus is looking at the sky, the theories have got up to needing about something like 55 different spheres to get this to work. You had spheres embedded in spheres, you had all kinds of complications. And we know, when we look back, that the reason it was so complicated and needed all these spheres is that the Earth is not in the center. Well, what Copernicus did when he was puzzling over all of this, he was a very clever chap, is he realized that if you imagined that you were standing on the sun, then it was suddenly much easier to solve the mathematical puzzle. Because from the vantage point of the sun, these spheres could just be neatly nested and all go around you, nicely behaved, and you didn't need all these extra details that people have been adding on for centuries. But in his mind, that didn't mean that the sun was in the middle. The Earth was still in the middle. It was just a really neat way of changing the problem so that you could solve it more simply. And this would allow you to predict the positions of the planets and that sort of thing with far less complication. But he didn't publish. And one of the reasons that he didn't publish, and probably the main reason that he didn't publish, is that he thought, well, everyone would laugh at him. It was just a bit of a silly idea. But some of his friends eventually managed to persuade him to do this, and including bishops of the church and so on. And one of them just added a little bit in the front of the book when it was published, saying, this is just a mathematical model. It was like a disclaimer, really, that just said, by the way, I'm not claiming that this is what it's really like. I'm just saying this is very useful. Okay. And so that book was published, and this myth goes around that no one read it. But that's not true. People did read it, and people thought it was interesting, and they thought it was clever. Now, along comes Galileo, and Galileo reads Copernicus's book, and he begins to think, hang on, I don't think this is just a mathematical trick. I think this really might be how the universe is. I think the universe, the sun might actually be in the middle, and the Earth might actually be going around it, and the other planets are going around it too. And that was quite radical to switch from saying, here's a nice model, to saying, now I've got a completely new description of how the universe actually is. And when he did that, he was going against Aristotle. He was going against the power of ancient Greece. He was going against our common sense because the Earth doesn't feel like it's moving. Owen Gingerich at Harvard said, you would have thought he was completely mad because if he was right, the Earth would be racing through space and everyone would be blown off it. So it was a completely nuts idea that didn't really match up with our day-to-day normal experience of life. But he's kind of doubled down on it. And in the process, he made a few enemies. Some of the enemies he made, in fact, most of them were Aristotelians. They didn't like it at all. They said to Galileo, you haven't got any evidence for this, other than your mathematical neatness. and they didn't want to rewrite their lectures and they didn't want to have to make their living a different way. Um, uh, I think most of you will know that the idea that you might have to rewrite your lecture notes is a pretty terrible nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we don't want to have to do that. So that was unpopular. Not only that, but Galileo himself was a bit of an abrasive character who tended to publicly mock people and wind them up. He wasn't too bothered about making enemies on that front, but he was a committed Christian. He believed that the Bible told the truth. He believed that Jesus was God. He believed in the virgin birth. He believed in creation. All these things. He wasn't some sort of brave atheist scientist going against the Catholic Church. He was a Catholic. Alan Chapman, the Oxford historian of science, says, "Let us remember that Galileo lived and died an obedient, if disputatious, son of the church." And he wrote a letter, Galileo wrote a letter in 1615 to the Grand Duchess Christina, which you can now download as a PDF and read it yourself. And you can see this guy is quite clearly a traditional Christian believer. But he was determined to push heliocentrism as far as he could and to teach it as fact. He was warned and told, no, you can teach it as a theory, but not as a fact. And a good friend of his, who he thought had his back, was later made Pope. And at that point, he thought, okay, I'm safe now. My friend is the Pope. And when your friend is the Pope, you can do what you want. So he wrote down his heliocentrism and went sort of pretty strong on it. And the Pope had cautioned him, and then he had put the arguments of the Pope into the mouth of a character that he called Simplicio, the fool, which is not a smart move. So now he's got a whole bunch of people upset with him. He's got some people who are upset with him because he's challenging Aristotle. He's got some people upset with him because he's publicly insulted them. And he's got a handful of people, but not a dominant group, upset with him because they read the Bible as saying, that the earth doesn't move. And this combination leads to him ending up on trial. And in his trial, he is charged, can you produce any scientific evidence for your position? And the evidence that he put forward was flawed. So the person overseeing the trial, Roberto Bellarmine, he said, look, we shouldn't be too hasty here and read things into the Bible that aren't there. If you can prove your case, then fair enough. But I haven't seen any proof. And so at that point, they gave him pretty much the lowest penalty that they could, something called vehement suspicion of heresy. So he wasn't actually convicted of heresy, but suspicion of heresy, which sounds like a technicality. He wasn't put in prison, he wasn't tortured, and he carried on writing physics for the rest of his life, including his most famous work on motion, lived another, I think, 30 or 40 years after this trial. And so what's happened really is, if the conflict thesis as a wider idea didn't exist, we would look at the Galileo story and say, here's a bunch of people being pretty annoying, pretty short-sighted, having a silly argument that was rather unnecessary, and the whole thing just got blown out of hand, and a group of people on both sides behaved in ways they shouldn't have behaved. But because we've got this overarching story of God and science are always opposed, what you can do is take the Galileo story and just slot it right into that and say, okay, here's a scientist opposed by the church, and the scientist was right. This is just another example of the church doing damage to science. It's a nice, easy, simple fit.
And one version of that story, that very simple, easy story, is that they burned him at the stake, which is just not true.
Yeah, it's amazing. John Merriman, who's literally the textbook writer for modern European history at Yale University, told his undergraduates in a lecture, which is online, that Galileo was burned at the stake, which is just not true.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. So for the sake of time, we'll go a bit more quickly. We've talked about Galileo. There's two particular stories I'd like you to tell us about, David. One will be how other scientists were treated, and Bruno would be one example that we'll talk about. But here, very quickly, is what my friends and family and colleagues thought how scientists were treated by the church.
I don't actually know if they did anything. I would say that they opposed them vocally, but did they do anything? I don't think they had the power to do anything.
Again, from my understanding off the top of my head, it was a similar reaction. They were, in many cases, tried as heretics or witches or what have you, and often shunned and discredited, if not worse. I've heard of various witch trials and things where they essentially the person is damned if they do, damned if they don't. They're essentially killed, and if they miraculously survive, they're proven guilty.
Oh no, they killed people and tortured them and imprisoned them because they didn't want what they were calling lies to be spread.
My recollection of history is that the church has treated science that disagrees with the church very harshly, brutally, whether it's excommunication or even martyrdom, or even silencing those who have come up with those ideas.
Usually I think they're pretty not terribly concerned about some of the science stuff. They're more concerned about other stuff. But largely, you got to toe the line. So sure, anything that casts out in the Bible or the church's teachings is, not just frowned upon, but, punished. Well, the ultimate would be, killing you, burning you at the stake, torturing you, excommunicating you, house arrest,
And then the second story I'd like to hear from you, David, as well. People have this image in their mind of the church burning libraries and books. Here's some examples of what they had to say.
Yes. The incidences of book burnings were really a fairly recent phenomenon. I don't know of in the distant past, but since the 1960s, I have heard of churches burning some textbooks and also music, things like that.
I remember the book burning, and I remember they would burn books so that knowledge could not be spread, or any information that was different couldn't be spread. And they imprisoned people. The church burned people, and it was for so-called witchcraft. But I think that was a way of keeping, again, different knowledge tamped down or unavailable to more people. But yeah, and then the Christian right doing that kind of now and getting rid of books and banning books. So yeah.
Yes, I definitely have heard stories. I'm not able to identify them specifically, but certainly my recollection of church history is of books being burned. Absolutely, books that were considered blasphemous.
Alexandria got burned. I'm not even sure who burned that one, to be honest. Was it the church? I'm not too sure.
So, David, again, you decide whether you want to talk about Bruno, Hypatia, or whoever you would like to talk about here.
Yeah, well, let's start with the libraries, because I think that's really helpful. It lays a nice background down for what comes afterwards. The image that people have in their mind often is that when Christianity started to become a real force in the Roman Empire under Constantine, that as Christianity spread, one of the first things it did was to try and destroy any philosophy or non-Christian learning that was around, especially if it was in a library where someone might access it. And so we needed to get rid of all of that and replace everything with just scripture. And of course, not scripture that anyone might be able to read, but scripture in a language that could only be held by the priests so that they could dominate everybody else and make sure that no one did any thinking of their own. And so when you start digging deeper, when you put a bit of pressure on this and you start investigating it, you find, well, there really isn't anything to this. It's a bit odd. In fact, quite early on in that era, we have Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, a convert to Christianity. And one of the things he talks about is the learning that comes through the Greek and Roman civilizations. And he describes it as gold from the Egyptians. And he's referring to a story in the Old Testament of the Exodus, when the Israelites are released from Egypt. And when they leave Egypt, the Egyptians give them gold, jewelry to take with them. And Augustine is essentially saying, well, look, the origin of the gold is from outside of the faith, but it's gold. And so, it's got use and it's got value and it's a gift. And he uses that analogy to describe the learning of the Greek and Roman civilizations, where he says This is like gold from the Egyptians. It might have come from outside of the faith, but it's gold. We should be studying this stuff. We should be using this stuff. It's got great value. And that is the general position of the church, that study and philosophy is of great value. And pretty soon in history, you get monks and monasteries where the main activity that goes on day to day is copying out these texts for the next generation. Because, papyruses and parchment don't last forever. And there's no printing press. There's no, you can't just go and photocopy this stuff. So you've got to copy it out. And so you end up with these texts being preserved, which is why we've got them. And what you don't get anywhere is libraries getting burnt down. The famous one that's mentioned is Alexandria.
Right.
Well, the Library of Alexandria was gone before Jesus was even born. So the only way that followers of Jesus could be responsible for burning it down would be if they had traveled backwards in time somehow. And time travel's not possible. If you disagree with me on that, then we can have a chat about it afterwards or possibly before. So we don't get this burning of libraries. But that idea has gone very deep into the public mind, and they can't shake it. They just think, oh yeah, that's what they did. They burned books. And Catherine Nixie wrote that in her history, and it turns up in ideas like that turn up in Edward Gibbon. They become very, very popular ideas, but they're simply not true. And then if we jump forward to, you mentioned Bruno. Well, Bruno is in between Copernicus and Galileo. And he's a very strange chap. He grows up in the Catholic Church. He trains to become a Catholic priest, but then he starts to develop some very heterodox ideas that end up getting him kicked out. He starts to deny the Trinity. He starts to deny the necessity of the church. He goes, as far as the Catholics are concerned, he's gone way off base. And he's sort of looking for some kind of spiritual home. And he is extremely rude. He makes Galileo look like a lovely guy. Okay? He's extremely rude and condescending and nasty, and he alienates people all over the place. And the story that we pick up of Bruno is he realized even before Galileo that the sun was in the middle and the earth was moving around, and then he was burned at the stake for it. Well, the truth of Bruno's story is actually that he did indeed like Copernicus's ideas, but his motivation for liking them is that he wanted the Earth to be able to move because he believed that the Earth was alive and had a soul. And if the Earth was alive and if the Earth did have a soul, then you would expect it to move around. And so Copernicus's theory gave him the perfect, motivation to say, well, look, the Earth is alive. And he had lots of very, very strange ideas, and none of them were scientific, really. He did say that the universe is infinite. There's an infinity of worlds, and our star is just one of many stars, and so on, which sounds scientific, but actually his reason for arguing that was theological. He said God is infinite, and an infinite creator has to create an infinite creation. So his argument was theological. It wasn't scientific. He was burned at the stake, shamefully, in my opinion. Nobody should ever have been burned at the stake for theological reasons or any other, really. It's unjustifiable. But he certainly wasn't burned as a scientist, and he wasn't burned for his science. It was a theological conversation that was going on. So to make him a martyr for science is a real misunderstanding of what happened. He shouldn't have been killed, but he wasn't killed because he was a scientist. If you could be burned at the stake for having scientific ideas, we would see it all the time, all over the place. But there is no record anywhere in all of recorded history of any scientist being put to death by any church for their science. I mean,
for their science,
non-existent. Yeah, for their science.
Right.
So these and many other stories, they are the reason that we have this idea in the Western 21st century zeitgeist of the Dark Ages. We hear a lot about the Dark Ages. And I think we're going to hear in a few minutes from you, David, that the Dark Ages never happened. They're a figment of people's imagination. But very quickly, let me just play this clip from my friends and neighbors and colleagues that I asked them, what do you know about the Dark Ages?
It was a period of time in the church's history that was marked by conflict, particularly between Christianity and Islam. as well, a period of time where the role of the church was really being worked out. The church figuring out its theology, its role as power, the relationship between the church and the church as state power, culminating in the Reformation at around the time of the subsequent Enlightenment.
They're the years before the Enlightenment, before science came alive, before there was much study of the mechanics of the way the earth worked.
Was a time when there was a stagnation in the advancement of scientific understanding. It was a time when people were not motivated to learn more about the cosmos and the world as in the natural world.
Why would they lose interest in learning?
Right. I think the Dark Ages was a time when the world was preoccupied with wars and infighting, and therefore scientific progress. Well, it didn't come to a halt because it hadn't started even.
The Dark Ages would be the ages where religion ruled and science was not practiced, and it was kind of a stagnant period in human scientific development.
Time of no knowledge, limited spread of knowledge. So it was the church keeping knowledge away from people so that they wouldn't be able to think, so that they wouldn't be able to challenge, so that they wouldn't be able to do anything differently than what was being done. So I think maintaining the status quo was the important thing, and maintaining power and control and whatever money, whatever, for themselves.
They're considered the Dark Ages just because they hadn't rediscovered free teachings largely brought in from the Muslim world. It wasn't a period of scientific flourishing or technological either too much.
So, David, that's what they think about the Dark Ages.
Yeah, and again, people think it because it's a very easy, simple idea. In comes the church, they burn the libraries down, now nobody knows anything. Well, what's the world going to be like when nobody knows anything? Well, everyone's going to be stupid. And if everyone's going to be stupid, then you're not going to have any growth or discovery or progress or hope or purpose or meaning. And for 1,000 years between 500 AD and 1500 AD, all you can really do is walk around in your own filth and hope that you don't die of the plague. But maybe if you did die of the plague, you're getting out of there a bit quicker, so that might be a bit better. And this idea is interesting. There are two different causes for this idea. The first one is every generation has a habit of saying that the people that came before were stupid. We just do it. That's what we do, right? And it's a way of making us feel that we're smarter. It's a way of patting ourselves on the back. Look how dumb they were until we came along. So there is a bit of that going on here. That there are writers in the Enlightenment that want to, as part of their own myth building and trumpet blowing, they want to say, "Oh, the people before us were dumb." But the second one is this narrative of God and science. Well, that was the God age, that we let God be in charge for 1,000 years and it was rubbish. And then we let science be in charge and now everything's brilliant. And that's a very, very simple, easy way to think about things. And when things are simple and easy, we tend to stick with them because we don't want to do the complicated. we don't have to think about the difficult ideas or that there may be some nuance. And that's all of us. I think we all would like to avoid nuance when we can, unless it's our own personal hobby horse. And so what really happened? Well, it's in the Middle Ages that you get the birth of education, comprehensive education. It's in the Middle Ages when you have universities. They grow out of cathedral schools. It's in the Middle Ages when you get a surge of invention that actually plenty of historians have said there was more invention in the Middle Ages. The folk in the Middle Ages in Europe were more inventive than the Romans were in terms of making new devices. You get all kinds of new agricultural devices. You get lots of architectural development, completely new techniques for building cathedrals and building ships, new ways of saddling your horses or ploughing your fields, new ways of navigating the world using compasses. We have spectacles being invented. We have people starting to work out angles of refraction that lead to rainbows. We have the development of mathematical science by the Merton calculators and even people earlier than that. And So it's this time of really quite dramatic leaps forwards in lots of areas, and you can read more about them and in more detail in the book, obviously. And Seb Falk has even written a book. He's a good scholar over here in the UK. He's even written a book called The Light Ages, where he shows what it was really like. Okay, it was actually the other way around completely. And all you need to do is just spend more than 5 minutes online and scroll down through the first three or four hits on a search, and you can find this scholarship now. And my suspicion is that it will start to be corrected in schools and universities over the next few decades anyway. It was an inventive time. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the obsession in the Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, with logic and reason. They considered logical thought to be pretty much the highest form of thought. And so if you wanted to be a priest, you had to be trained up in logic. One of the books that was used to do that was called Sic et Non, Yes and No, that had hundreds and hundreds of statements in it. And you were required to be able to either say, yes, that statement was true, or no, it wasn't true. And you didn't know which way round you were going to get asked it, so you didn't know how you were going to have to defend it. And it was a test of your logic. So examples would be something like, could two angels be in the same place as each other? And you had to be able to answer yes or no, because if angels are immaterial, then does that mean, if you've got one angel walking towards another, that they're just going to pass through each other? Or does it mean that there's some kind of other reason why they can't occupy the same space? Because, in Aristotelian thought, if two things, well, an object has a location and it's unique to that object. Or if God knows the future, then do you really have a decision to make? Are you really making a decision? And you didn't know whether you were going to be asked to say yes, you do, or no, you didn't. And so they were obsessed with this rationality. And in a lot of ways, they were far more obsessed with logic and reason than we are now.
At the height of, I don't know if you'd still call it the Middle Ages, but I mean, it produced people like Aquinas, who is this brilliant logician, and and applies that kind of reasoning to theology. And I mean, I think that most scholars would agree that no matter whether you agree with Aquinas or not, you're dealing here with a real genius. And why did that come out of this period of such complete darkness and ignorance? Now, he was affected by Arabic learning, that is true, but still also, a long tradition of Greek learning. So an age, to a certain extent, I think an age can be characterized by what it produces. And what did this period produce? It produced science and supposed enlightenment and so on. So,
yeah, if you had just Aquinas and no one else for 1,000 years, then you would say, okay, he's an anomaly.
Yeah,
you don't.
No.
All the way through this period, you get these great minds. There's Bede, from not far from where I live, and you keep tracking through, and you find that people are writing, Sacrobosco, John Sacrobosco. You find that you get these brilliantly intelligent writers who are consumed by, everybody wants to read what they're writing, and it's a time where study is really actually exciting and what people aspire to.
Hey, gentlemen, for the sake of time, what I'd like to do now is to talk about why it is that we today still have this idea of the Dark Ages. Why is this so endemic, so ingrained in the Western zeitgeist?
So once Draper and White's narratives had become really popular, they had a route to the general public, but they also had a route into the academy. And the route into the academy was a guy called George Sarton, who wondered, hang on, when we study history, we've got a history of this, history of that, but there's no history of science. You can't study the history of science at university. And he thought this was outrageous. So he decided, okay, well, I'm going to start teaching it, and eventually birthed the world's first history of science department and trained up the first cohort of historians of science, academic historians of science. And he was a disciple of Andrew Dickson White. So what happens? The very first group of professional historians of science in the academy, who then disperse from this first department set up their own departments of the history of science at universities all across the world. And what's the message they're bringing? It's the Draper and White conflict thesis. And so now you have a generation across multiple countries and institutions. You have an entire generation being taught this at the academic level, that this is true, that the Draper White stories are true. And simultaneously, they sold into the popular science market because of Edward Humans being such a brilliant publisher and distributor and marketer. So you've got this twin attack where the professionals in the universities are saying it and people have this awareness of it in the public. So it's just going to get everywhere. It gets its fingers everywhere. And on top of that, it also does something which I think a lot of people quite like. It gives you a story with a baddie and a goodie. And so you think, okay, I can learn that. That's a very easy story to learn, and it's a very easy one to hold on to. And it has a further advantage, which is if you don't believe in God, or you don't like religion, or you're looking for an excuse to not believe in God or not have to think about it, this is mighty convenient because you can just say, all right, well, I don't have to worry about all that God stuff because I know that God and science are opposed and I know that science is pretty good. So now here is my out. This is my escape clause where I don't have to do that stuff if I don't want to do it. And so when you combine all of those factors, that's almost perfect for a story to just take over. And it does take over. And then it's popularized by science popularizers because they think, and to a certain extent, you've got to have sympathy. They think that they are really saying the truth, and they can always find quotes to back it up, right? If Neil deGrasse Tyson wants to tell everybody that Christianity taught that the world was flat and everyone thought the world was flat until Columbus sails around the earth, he doesn't just have to go to Andrew White's book to claim that. He can go to any one of hundreds of other books that came afterwards that are written by academics who repeat White, right? Or if a senator on the Senate floor wants to say that the church banned dissection, he doesn't have to go back to White's book or Draper's book. He can find a college textbook that will confirm that for him, right? So it just starts to proliferate, basically, and into the public sphere. And then when you've got the internet, it's almost unstoppable. It just goes and goes and goes and goes. The famous quote that does the rounds a lot of the time is John Calvin, saying, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe Copernicus or the Holy Spirit? Right? And you'll find that quote all over the place, and you'll find it in quite learned texts. But it's a fabrication. Calvin never wrote it. Calvin never mentioned Copernicus in any of his texts. And in fact, Calvin wrote that astronomy was something that was the duty of someone who had that gifting, and he actively encouraged it. So you're going to hear these things repeated, and then you get like Dan Brown including it in Origin, and it's very, I mean, when you sell millions and millions and millions of copies of a fiction book, and I'm selling a couple of hundred copies of of Popes and Unicorns, that's a little bit of a one-sided fight. And when you've got a brilliant chap who pays attention to detail, a chap called Tim O'Neill, who runs the YouTube channel website History for Atheists, he himself is an atheist, but he's got fed up with the conflict thesis. He writes brilliantly researched, nuanced articles that are very entertaining. He's debunking all this stuff. He's doing it accurately. But how many hits does he get? He gets a few hundred hits or a few thousand hits maybe. And in the meantime, Neil deGrasse Tyson is on syndicated TV and reaching tens or hundreds of millions.
And we also hear this from people like Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, you mentioned Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens. There's so many high-profile social influencers, and they're repeating that story.
Yeah, and they're repeating it, feeling confident about it because they've read this stuff somewhere. They're not picking it out of a vacuum, right? So if you think that such and such is true, and you think it suits your worldview, and you can find it quickly somewhere, why would you dig deeper to find out, is it definitely completely really true? It's hard work sometimes. When we were researching for this book, you'd be chasing footnote after footnote after footnote, further and further and further back, and it's getting really obscure. And then eventually you find out where this thing appeared, and it's not where it supposedly was. That's hard work, and most people don't have time to do something like that, or the
Right.
motivation.
Yeah. So we're putting a lot of blame on social influencers, college and university textbooks, TV, Family Guy. But I'm wondering if there's other things that we should talk briefly about. We don't have a lot of time, but I wonder if, for example, resistance coming from areas of science, resistance to Christians holding positions of authority, Francis Collins and the NIH, for example, is one. Or there may also be examples where the church itself is perpetuating the myth. I'm thinking of youth group leaders telling how scientists were burned at the stake, pastors saying from the pulpit. So maybe, David, just tell us briefly if there's other reasons other than these popularizers that we're putting all the blame on. Are there things that we should be looking at to answer why this myth is so persistent in the 21st century zeitgeist?
Yeah, I think the church can contribute to this problem and does contribute to it. And I think it's because they've inherited this idea that God and science are opposed. Now, if you say to somebody, by the way, did you know God and science are opposed? And they love God, then they're going to say, oh, right, well, if God and science are opposed, then I obviously must not like science, right? That's going to be their response to it. Ideally, what you'd like them to do is say, no, God and science aren't opposed, or I haven't heard that before. I'm going to read up on it, and I'm going to go and buy Of Popes and Unicorns and sort this out. But a lot of the time, they just say, well, if God and science are opposed, science must be bad, scientists must be bad, we should be wary of science, so we're going to set our stall out. We are religious, we are Christians, we're followers of God, so we're not going to do that science stuff. And they are victims of the conflict thesis narrative in a very strange way. They've accepted the conflict thesis narrative and they've thrown out science.
Right.
Right? In the same way that other people have accepted it and thrown out God. And that's a bit of a tragedy, really. It's a tragedy on a number of fronts. One is there will be people growing up in churches who have got the potential to be excellent scientists and who don't go into science, right? And we see that happen in the sense that Rebecca McLaughlin, who is a brilliant writer and theologian, she said, look, if you want to know why there's underrepresentation of certain groups of people in the sciences, including women and people of ethnic minorities, it may well be because you're missing out on the religious folk. The religious folk aren't going into science because they've been told they can't. And statistically, they're more likely to be women and they're more likely to be members of ethnic minorities. And so they're not going into the sciences. So if you want to fix that, one of the ways of fixing that and getting more people, more representation in science, is to make sure that the science itself has thrown out the conflict thesis and said, by the way, if you believe in God, you're welcome here, right? We encourage it. And then the other thing that can happen is churches and church movements can become so vociferously anti-scientific that they embarrass themselves.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, this potential good news of, did you know that there's a life beyond this life where everything is glorious and that you've been invited into that life? It's given to you as a free gift by the God who loves you and made you. But by the way, we're going to taint all this good news that we've got for you by telling you also that science is really bad. And so if you want to come join this and you want to accept the invitation and you want to get to know God yourself, you've got to ditch all your science. What a ridiculous thing to be telling people. It's putting a stumbling block in the way. It's a barrier to entry that doesn't need to be there. And that's problematic. And then there's a third issue of people growing up in some churches where they've been told all this stuff and then they go to university or college or they leave home and all of a sudden they realize science isn't bad and they say, but I was told science was bad. And that's a major challenge to their faith and sometimes can sort of completely derail them. And we don't really want that happening.
I know what you're saying. That's the story of my life.
Same here. Yep.
So, okay, gentlemen, we are pretty well out of time. I do know that you've written 3 books. We heard about all 3 of them already, but I know that there's another one coming down the pipeline. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I'm working on book number 4, pivoting to philosophy on this one. What are the philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God? That's been really good fun. My background is physics, and so getting into the philosophy of science and morality and all these kind of things, really, really interesting. And just working at the minute on a chapter about the fine-tuning of the universe. Why is the universe just right for life, and what are the possible explanations of that? And enjoying the fact that most people seem to say, well, if it isn't God, then it has happened by chance, and we just got to say, well, we got lucky. And there'll be chapters on cosmological arguments and moral arguments and so on. And again, the idea is for it to be entertaining and story-packed and lots of fun. It hasn't got a title yet, but it's coming down the line, and I will keep you in the loop.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we really appreciate you giving us your perspective. It's very complimentary to what we heard from Dr. Ungurianu. He's more of the historian, but you gave us the popular version, the one that our audience will be hearing from all the time, from influencers like Tyson, Dawkins. We've mentioned the names many times. And we really, I've enjoyed this conversation with you. I read your book 3 times. I read it a year ago. I loved it. Picked it up about 3 months ago because I thought, you know what, I want to read this again because I've forgotten some of the details. So I read it a second time. And then, of course, preparing for this conversation today, I had to go through it again. It is a great read. It's an easy read. You do not have to be a scholar to read it, and I do highly recommend it.
Thank you very much for your generosity.
Thanks, David. We will talk again.
Thanks. Have a good evening.
All right. God bless you guys.
Bye. See you, David.
Bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.